Welcome to the Westport Library. Today's program will begin momentarily. Supported by Verso Studios, created locally and shared with the world.
This team will be scrutinized, celebrated for as long as the game is played.
In pro football, nobody's entitled to anything. You have to go out there and earn it.
I was pretty intent on proving myself.
We were going to determine the future of football in New England.
The Patriots are Super Bowl champions!
First dynasty of the century. This game is like a narcotic. You're chasing that forever.
Breaking news right now.
Spygate. Deflategate.
Aaron couldn't separate himself from that dark side.
That team won enough to become the villain.
We worked for Bill, but we played for Tom.
Bill tore Brady's head completely off.
There's things that are done that can't be undone.
I was just trying to hold it together the best I could.
This team will be scrutinized, celebrated for as long as the game of football is played.
Good evening to you all, and welcome to another collaboration between the Westport Public Library and the Wise Men of Westport and Weston. My name is Bruce Borner, and I am the president of the Wise Men of Westport and Weston. Before we begin, I'd like to mention that we are meeting today in the Trev's Forum, which was named after philanthropist Christian Treves and his wife Ava. Christian passed away this week. We honor the family for the many contributions they made to this library, to the Westport Playhouse, and to the town of Westport in general. Christian was one of us, a wise man. A memorial service will be held this Wednesday at Greens Farms Congregational Church. In the very unlikely, if not impossible chance that you've not heard of the Wise Men, we are a retired or semi-retired men's club with over 550 members. We meet weekly over coffee, donuts, and bagels with a world-class speaker. In fact, only 2 weeks ago, the Westport Library and the Wise Men sponsored a panel discussion with Senator Richard Blumenthal, CNN's Allison Camerota, and other media notables, including our own local media blogger, Dan Woog. Soon, the Wise Men will be sponsoring, as part of Verso Fest at the library, the appearance of Dave Letterman music director Paul Schaefer. Our club offers over 35 sub-clubs, including hiking, travel, walking, tennis, golf, boating, chess, gardening, photography, etc. If you want, please pick up a brochure at the table back there somewhere on your way out. Before I get to Jeff, I just want to thank Cobs Bakery for providing the scones that they did. If you didn't get one, make sure you do, because they've got lots. Speaking of world-class speakers, it is my privilege to introduce Jeff Benedict. Jeff is a #1 New York Times best-selling author and an Emmy award-winning producer whose storytelling power has captivated audiences across mediums. Benedict has written 17 nonfiction books and many feature stories about some of the most iconic figures in sports history. He has been tapped as an executive producer and writer for a documentary adaptations of his books, including a 10-part series based on his bestseller, The Dynasty, the definitive inside story of the New England Patriots. Benedict wrote and produced the Emmy Award-winning Netflix documentary, Poisoned, which was based on his book of the same name, In 2023, he wrote the biography of LeBron James, an instant New York Times bestseller that critics called masterful and propulsive. In 2021, Benedict co-produced the HBO documentary Tiger, based on his #1 best-selling biography, Tiger Woods. Jeff also wrote Hall of Fame quarterback Steve Young's autobiography, QB. A former special features writer for Sports Illustrated and the Los Angeles Times, Benedict is a sought-after commentator for his unmatched ability to get to the heart of a historic moment or figure, sculpt a narrative, and look for the untold story. We are grateful to Jeff for having spoken to the wise men at least 4 times over the past 20 years, with each being an outstanding presentation. Sorry, Jeff, there's no more time. Just kidding. Jeff, we welcome you to the stage.
It's really great to be back in Westport. I love this town. The library here, I think it's one of the best library programs in the state of Connecticut. And the wise men have been a really great friend to me over the years as a writer. I think this is a 5th or 6th time that I've been with you guys, but it's the first time that we've done this at the library. So I'm particularly grateful to Pete Walgast, who I've known now for 25 years and was the one who first invited me to speak to your organization back in the very early 2000s. So thanks for having me back. I also, well, it's gone now, but I was just gonna mention, I have a lot of friends in the audience tonight, some of whom live here, but one of my very best friends is Armin Katayan, who is here. And that book we actually wrote together. So that's by Jeff and Armin. And it was a tremendous experience to work together with Armin before doing these two. So I think what would be great for tonight, because we have a nice large audience, is I'm only going to talk for a few minutes, and then what I'd really like to do is just do an engaging Q&A, because there's a lot of things that may be more interesting to you to ask about and me talk about than me just winging it up here. So what I will say, though, is the Dynasty, unlike these other 2 books that you see on the screen, was a book that I wanted to write for a long time. And I grew up in Connecticut. I'm a New England native. I did not grow up a Patriots fan, but there was a point in time, probably around 2014, when the Patriots had gone 10 years without winning a Super Bowl, after winning 3 in 4 years in the early 2000s. And what was really interesting to me was, here we were 10 years out, and Tom Brady and Bill Belichick and Robert Kraft were still together, which I was thinking, like, that's actually never happened before. There have been a few instances in the history of professional football where there's been a dynasty. The Packers had one in the 60s. The Steelers had one in the 70s. The 49ers had one in the 80s. And each of those dynasties ended after about a decade. They'd had their run, they'd won their Super Bowls, and then they broke up. And what struck me about this one was they had their run, they won their Super Bowls, and they didn't break up. And they didn't break up, and they didn't break up. They just kept staying together. Yet for 10 years, they were winning a lot of games, and they were going to the playoffs virtually every season. But they weren't winning Super Bowls anymore. They lost 2 to the Giants, and they didn't win again. And to me, that was extraordinary. And then all of a sudden, it happened again, and they won 3 more. And that's what distinguished them from every other professional football dynasty that's ever existed, was the length of time. For 20 years, the nucleus of the team stayed together, and they kept winning. So I approached the Patriots actually right after they lost to the Eagles in the Super Bowl in January of 2018. That's when I reached out to the team, because to me, it seemed like this thing was finally winding down. And at that point, they'd won 5, and it was questionable whether they'd win another one. But either way, it looked like the Brady-Belichick relationship probably wouldn't survive much longer. And that's when I approached the team. And the way that I did that is I wrote a letter to the owner, Robert Kraft. And I did that for a couple of reasons. It's kind of old-fashioned to write a letter. But I didn't have any connection to the team. I didn't know anybody in the organization. So I didn't have an in. And I'd never covered the team. It's not like I'd written about them before. I hadn't. So I wrote a letter to the owner because just a little inside baseball thing is when I pitched this to my publisher, Simon & Schuster, I worked really hard on the pitch, and then I went to meet with the publisher and my editor and my agent. And I was prepared for the publisher to say, it's a great idea, but it's not for us. Because Simon & Schuster doesn't do very many sports books. And to be honest, sports books don't sell well for the most part. It's a tough genre to make a commercial success. And so I had my counter argument for when they said no, but I never had to use it because I made my pitch and the publisher surprisingly said, it's a great idea. When you get access to one of the big 3, we'll give you a contract. And, you know, Armin and I had just finished Tiger, and we did that was a #1 bestseller, and we didn't have access to Tiger. And I was like, I can do this without that. And he was determined that it had to be with that. And I said, well, that could take a while. And he said, well, we got all day. You know, if you want, go do a different book. Come to us with another idea. While you work on that, we'll sign you to do a different book. And I said, that is my idea. That's my idea. And good ideas are hard to come by. And so I knew that if I was going to get to do this, I had to get the access. And I thought I'd go through the owner because he's the owner. It's his team. And it wouldn't really do me much good to get access to Tom if the owner wasn't on board. But if I could get the owner on board, I figured everybody would get on board. And so that's the approach I took. And I wrote him an old-fashioned letter, and then nothing. It was crickets for months. And I signed another book contract to do LeBron, and I went off and started writing LeBron. And then one day, about 6 months later, I got a letter in my mailbox here in Connecticut, and it was the old-fashioned kind. It was a letter, and I knew when I saw it in the box, I knew who it was from, because I'd not seen many envelopes like that. You know, it is special paper, very fancy, and I opened it up, and sure enough, it was a letter from Robert to me. And before I read it, as soon as I realized I have a letter from him, I immediately made an assumption, which was he's different because not many people write letters anymore. And most people in his position certainly wouldn't write me a letter. There's a lot of other ways to tell me no, but not go through the trouble of the letter. And it turns out it wasn't a no, but it was a very, very kind, thoughtful letter. It wasn't a yes by any means. It was an acknowledgement that he'd gotten mine, a thank you. He'd gotten the materials I sent him. I sent him some of my work, and I'd sent him some references, people he could call that I knew he knew, and that I knew their credibility was extremely high. So if he did call them, he'd be able to trust what they said about me. And I wrote the letter that way because I approached this like I was applying for a job, kind of like when I was coming out of college. And that's just the way I went about it. And probably another month and a half went by, and then his vice president of communications called me one day and asked if we could talk, and we had a nice conversation on the phone. And it went well enough that he said, I'm going to go talk to Mr. Kraft. I'll be back to you this afternoon. He came back this afternoon, and he said, would you be willing to come to the stadium tomorrow to meet with Mr. Kraft? And naturally, I said, yes, of course. And I got my car and drove up there. And that was my first time meeting anybody in the organization. The first person I met was the owner. And I walked in as very big office with very impressive things. You know, the first thing I noticed when I walked in was a beautiful red electric guitar. And he noticed me looking at it and he said, "Do you know who that's from?" I said, "No." He said, "It's from Bono." And I was thinking, all right, I like this guy already. I looked around the room because you can learn a lot about a person if you ever make it inside their office. You know, pictures tell you a lot about what matters to that, whoever that individual is. Do they have pictures of their family, their children? Do they have pictures of famous people? Do they have expensive artwork? I mean, you can learn a lot. And when I was looking around the room at his pictures, I was thinking, I think I might like him, even though I don't know him yet. And we spent a couple hours together that day. And at the end of it, it was the first day of training camp. And so there's like thousands of fans out on the practice field for the first day of training camp. Keep in mind, Brady's still on the team, and they're still at the tippity top. So there's a lot of people out there. I'd never been to training camp in my life. So that was going to be new, and the Vice President of Communications, after my meeting, he said, I'm going to take you down to the practice field, and I'm going to put you where you can stand, and when Mr. Kraft comes out, you're going to be allowed to follow him. He's going to take you out on the field. And he said, I'll show you where to stand and all that stuff. I said, okay, fine. So we go down there, and they have the yellow ribbon up, and I stood right where they told me and waited for him to come out. And a few minutes later, he did. And as soon as he came out, he didn't acknowledge me, even though I just spent 2 hours with him. He walked right past me. But I knew my cue was, when he did that, lift the rope and follow him and stay right next to him. That's what I was told. If he goes, you go. If he stops, you stop. And don't talk to anybody. Simple instructions. So he comes, I see him, he goes right by me. I lift the rope up, I step under the rope, and all of a sudden, this guy grabs me by the shoulder. I thought he was gonna injure me. You know, he grabbed me, and he had, in a very deep voice, he's like, "Where do you think you're going?" And I'm like, what the heck? It was his bodyguard. And someone forgot to tell him that I was allowed to go. His name is Al, and Al's been with him forever. And Al became one of my best friends on this project. And that's how I met Al, the vice grip. Fortunately, the VP guy was standing there, and he goes, "Oh, no, Al, it's all right. Jeff's okay. Robert said he could go with him." And I followed him out on the field, and next thing I know, I'm from here to that monitor from Bill and Tom. And I thought to myself, holy mackerel, like, I'm here. It was crazy. And just about a month ago, over the break, my daughter was working for me in between semesters over the holidays. She wanted to earn some extra money, so I had her in the office. And I had her working on my journals. And I was helping her, like, she was helping me organize some stuff. And I found one of my journal entries. It was actually a transcript. I had forgotten that the day that I went to meet Robert for the first time, I don't have it with me, but I carry a tape recorder. It's a digital one. It's about the size of my phone. And as I was driving up to the stadium from my house here in Connecticut, I put the tape recorder on and I set it on the seat, the passenger seat, and I let it run while I was driving, and I talked. You know, instead of writing, I just talked into the recorder. And it recorded my thoughts as I was pulling into the stadium and anticipating what was going to happen. And it was emotional for me just a month ago to go back and read that and go, holy cow, like, that's when it all started, when I did that. And I never would have imagined that that was in July 26th, 2018. So 7 months after they lost to the Eagles, I stepped in the organization for the first time. And 6 months later, they were in the Super Bowl against the Rams. And I asked Robert and his son, Jonathan, I was really in now, and I said, in order to do what I want to do the right way, I really need to go with you to the Super Bowl. I don't want to just go to the game. I actually don't care about the game. What I need to do is I need to see what you do for a week going into the Super Bowl. So I want to get on your plane in Lexington, Massachusetts at the hangar, and I want to fly with you and your son to the game. I want to ride in your car to the hotel. I just want to follow you around. And that's more interesting than the game. Anybody can watch the game. 100 million people are going to watch the game. There isn't anything I'm going to be able to write about the game that they can't watch on TV. But nobody gets to see what you do, and that's what I want to do. And that's the kind of experience it was, this whole project. Last thing I'll say, and then we'll go to questions. Tom, Bill, and Robert were all very different in terms of how they handled the interviews. And naturally, everybody's, as they should be, they're concerned about how they're going to be portrayed and how they're going to be treated on the page and stuff like that. And this was my book. They don't own it. I do. I own the copyright. They're not paying me. Simon & Schuster pays me. So I can do whatever I want. I mean, when I say that, I mean, I can be dishonest. I can promise you that, oh, I would never write such and such. I could do that. Once. And then you'd never get in anywhere. So they trusted me, and I'd been around them enough. But when we got to the interviews, I was respectful during the season. When I got in there, they were just going into the season, and I understood that during the season, I said up front, I'm not going to ask to interview players and coaches during the season, because I saw how intense the whole organization was. It was intimidating to be in the building. And I don't get intimidated easily, but I was intimidated. And I realized how much pressure, you could just feel the pressure in the building. I felt it every time I went there. I was like, oh my God. It was intense. And so I just said to the ownership, I'm not going to ask for access to players and coaches during the season. And I was allowed to be in the locker room because I understood my place. My place was not, I was not there as a reporter. I'm not going up to guys. I'm not saying hi to Tom. You know, I'm there like a fly on the wall, which is exactly what I wanted. I didn't want the players to know there's a journalist in the room, because I want people to just be themselves. And that's what was great about it. But when it was time to ask Tom and Bill for questions, for interviews, they had a different approach, the two of them, which was nice. Bill wanted all the questions in writing in advance. And I've done that plenty of times. And that can actually be a really good thing, because it's possible to get a more thoughtful interview if the person you're interviewing has time to contemplate, what do you want to talk about? Instead of just like meeting them and then 5 minutes later you're asking them to recall something from 22 years ago. And a lot of what I need to ask is very detailed, and it's deep back. And so with Bill, I thought this is great. And so I did. I wrote them all out, all of them, and sent them in. Emailed them to Bill. And Bill's guy comes back and says, you really want to ask all of these? And I was like, I mean, that's actually how they said it to me. And I said, yeah, like, if he's willing, this is all of what I want to know. And I was just thinking with Bill, Bill's a very, he's a reader. Bill reads a lot. He has a library in his house. He's smart, and he's strategic in how he deals with the media. And I was thinking of a lesson I learned in law school in my first year, where we learned how to write briefs. I'll never forget my professor telling me and teaching us that The reason briefs are so important is because this is how you communicate with a judge. You don't get to just call the judge and talk. You communicate with judges in writing. So you need to know how to write a brief and think of it as a conversation. So if you want the judge to actually read your brief, the judge already knows the law. He doesn't need you to tell him what the law is. So if you want him to read anything, past the first paragraph, tell him a story in the first paragraph so that he reads on. And that's what I think of here with Bill. This is a chance for me to communicate with Bill in writing. It's a way to show Bill I'm a serious guy. I'm a serious guy trying to do a serious job, and I've done my homework and my research, and I'm not going to waste your time with stupid questions. I'm not going to ask you about 3rd and 10. I'm going to ask you these things. And so, anyways, he came back and said he'd answer. He didn't answer all of them, but he answered enough of them. And he answered in writing, which means there's no question about what he meant and said. For me, I consider that a win. That's a win with Bill. Tom, on the other hand, it was totally different. I offered the questions in advance to Tom, and Tom was like, it's not necessary. And so Tom doesn't know what I'm going to ask him in advance, and we go into a room, which was at the stadium. He's the only player in the organization, I would say rightfully so, who has his own suite that's on the same level as where the owner's suite is. So these are where the guys with really big money buy the most expensive suites. That tier of suites, Tom gets one. Tom has a box. And I was told that that's where the interview would take place. And I was like, okay, great. So I asked the team, I said, can I get in the box 3 hours before the interview? I remember the vice president of communications going, you want to go in the box 3 hours before Tom gets there? And I was like, yeah, I do. Why do you want to do that? And I said, because I want to be prepared. I mean, I've never talked to this guy. And he's one of the 3 most important people in the story. And I've spent 25 hours writing these questions and refining them over the course of months. And I want to be in the right frame of mind when he gets there. So they put me in there. They brought me peanut butter and jelly sandwiches. It was fantastic. And I sat there, and when he walked in, I felt like I was so ready to go and excited. And he walked in, and he comes through the door looking very charismatic. I'll never forget, he's wearing white jeans, a white jacket, it's summertime. He looks cool. He looked like a movie star. He did not look like Bill. And he walked in, and the first words out of his mouth were, I've had a shitty day. And I thought, oh, geez. I'm thinking, this is not great. Like, this is not how you want to start. He's in a bad mood. He's pissed off. And I was immediately trying to think, how am I going to, what should I do? And I knew it was his birthday. I'd actually gone out and bought a birthday card because I knew it was his birthday. And I wrote something to him, and my intention was I was going to give him the card after we were all done and say, happy birthday. And I thought, plan B. So he sat down. I pulled the card out of my bag, and I said, this is kind of corny, but I know it's your birthday. I got your birthday card, and I shoved it across the table. And he opened it up, and I was watching him read it, and he started laughing. He grinned because it was corny. And it totally broke the ice. And he looks at me and he goes, so how's it going? And I knew he was baiting me. And I looked at him and I said, you work for this team. I think you know how it's going. And he started cracking up. And from there, we were just off to the races. It was one of the best interviews I've ever had the experience of being a part of in my whole career. It was fantastic. And when it ended, something happened that I didn't expect that caused me to completely rethink the beginning of the book. So those of the few of you in the room who may have already read the book, you know it opens in an operating room at Mass General Hospital, and Drew Bledsoe is under, and the surgeon is cutting his chest open. Like you're looking over the surgeon's shoulder as he cuts the incision and goes in to try to stop the flow of blood into his lung. That's the opening scene of the book, and it's a prologue. But as soon as you come out of the prologue, I intended to go somewhere else until I interviewed Tom. And then I realized, oh, this could be chapter 1 in the present. You know, because the Drew Bledsoe scene in the hospital happens 2 weeks or 1 week after 2 weeks after 9/11. Football's suspended for a week because of 9/11. And the first game back, the Patriots play the Jets, and Mo Lewis crushes Drew Bledsoe. And he hits him so hard that his ribs fracture, and one of the fractured ribs is jagged. It severs an artery, and the artery starts pumping blood into his lung, and nobody knows it. And they rush Drew to the hospital after the game just to check on him. And then when the surgeon comes in, he's like, holy shit. If we don't stop this bleeding, this guy's gonna die like right here. That's in 2001. I'm now in Tom's suite in 2019 now. It's 2019. They've beaten the Rams in the Super Bowl. I'm now getting to interview Tom, and I'm wondering what everyone in New England's wondering, which is this his last season in New England? And Tom's not saying. And I'm in the suite with him, and at the end, we're looking out at the football field because we're in the suite. And the stadium's completely empty. There's no one there. Football season hasn't started yet. Training camp is going. There's no goal post because they just had a soccer game. And in the 3 hours I was there by myself, one of the things I was thinking as I looked out at this, I was thinking, wow, like I'm in the room where Giselle and their children and Tom's parents, this is where they sit to watch Tommy every week. Tom's never been in here. He doesn't come in here. He's always down there. He's gonna be in here with me, and I was thinking, how weird is it gonna be for him to be up here and look down at the empty stadium? And I started thinking, like, if he's a reflective guy, I wonder what he would think as he's pondering the end of his time in the NFL. So I asked him that while he was looking out at the big field. And it was such an awesome moment because he reflected. Like it was like just train of thought, stream of conscience. And I had my tape recorder going. It's like, when he did that, I was like, this has to be how the book opens, right? It has to be Tom at the start of his last season in New England, if it is his last season. And what is he thinking then? And it was just fantastic. And that all happened in that interview. And so, so the guys were different. Robert was just, there's a gentleman here, the light is too bright, so I can't find you, but there was a gentleman who came up to me before this started tonight who's been a season ticket holder since 1982. Are you still here? Somewhere? Yeah, okay, now I can see you. And you were telling me, you've been going in there since it was Schaefer Stadium, and you were telling me about how great of a guy Bob Kraft is, and you said you must have spent some time with him. I spent hundreds of hours with him. Hundreds of hours over a 5-year period. I mean, I mean, I was a witness to that over and over and over again. So when a Boston Globe columnist like Dan Shaughnessy, who's never spent 5 seconds with him in his entire career as a Boston Globe writer, excuse my French, says crazy shit about him all the time in the Globe, but's never met the man. He's never eaten a meal with him. He's never watched him take a phone call and deal with really difficult people to deal with on the other end of the phone. He's just never seen how he operates, like what he does. I was a witness to that for 5 years. And I felt like I really knew him. You know, when I was writing scenes with him in it, I never doubted that I wasn't capturing like who he is. By the way, same thing with his son. They're extremely private people, and I knew they had extended an unusual amount of trust, and I was always super respectful of that. There was only one time that I got yelled at on this project, and I did get yelled at. And it was during the season, and I was allowed in the locker room with those rules I told you. Don't go up to anybody, don't talk to anybody. There was one player on the team that I actually knew from before named Kyle Van Noy. He played linebacker for Brigham Young University. And when Armin and I wrote a book, before Tiger, Armin and I did one other book about college football. And I covered BYU for that book. And I shadowed Kyle Van Noy in college. Now he ends up on the Patriots. I'm doing the Patriots book. He's the only person I knew. There was one game where the Patriots came back at the very end and they won a game against Miami. And when the players came running in the locker room, they were so ecstatic. And I'm in there, because I follow the owner, and I'm in there, I'm in my spot. And the team came in like a stampede. And Kyle saw me, and he was so excited, he ran up to me. He threw his arms on me, full shoulder pads, you know, this is insanity. And he's so strong. I mean, I felt like probably like a piñata to him. He lifted me right off the ground. And it looked like I was celebrating with the team. I wasn't, because I know I'm not supposed to do that. And I got reamed out for that. And I had to explain, whoa, whoa, whoa. You know, I said, wait a second. I actually know him. I know his parents, I know his brother, I've known them for a long time. This isn't what it looks like. And once I explained that, it was fine. But that's the kind of thing it was for these years inside the team. So I love the project, and I'll take whatever questions you want to ask, and I'll just say there's a microphone over there, but a lot of you that are on this half of the room and you don't feel like getting up, which would be me, if you want to just stay in your seat and ask the question, I will repeat the question so the recorder gets it and the people on the other side of the room. I'll make it as convenient as I can.
Very good, Jeff. And just come on up here and line up and ask questions. Thank you very much. Very insightful about this. And I'm going to start off, but I'm going to ask you a question.
Okay.
Because this is a very, very interesting approach to what you're doing. And
Yep.
there are a lot of, I've experienced some similar things that we'll talk about at some point with another football team that you know well, actually. But I want to ask you, what's next? What have you got in the hopper right now?
Well, so normally I would not answer that question. I almost never do that. The only reason I'm going to answer the question is because we're in Westport. And for self-interest reasons, there may be someone in the room who knows Paul Newman's children. And so for that reason, I will say what I'm doing next. And if there is anyone here who has a connection to any of Paul Newman's family, please see me after. I'm doing Tom Cruise's biography, and I'm 2+ years into it, and it's the most dramatic thing I've ever been around. It's an unbelievably great story. And the Paul Newman part is pretty great too. So I can't say anything more than that, but that's what I'm doing next.
Great. It sounds, I'm looking forward to that. Next, Pete.
So great to have you here, Jeff.
Thanks, Pete.
And you've been a wonderful friend to the Wisemen for 25 years. One of the things that really shows what a wonderful person Robert Kraft is how he pursued and wooed his wife. I wish you would tell us about that.
Sure.
And then maybe move on to two other very important people in his life, and that's Bill and Tom. How did he manage to get them into the Patriots?
Okay. I love talking about Myra, his wife. Obviously, Myra had passed away before I came along. But I thought that her story was incredibly important in terms of helping people understand who who the owner was and is. My favorite scene to write in the book has got nothing to do with football. It's the opening. It's the opening to chapter 2. So the prologue is Bledsoe on the table. Chapter 1 is Tom reflecting on his future right before he leaves the team. And chapter 2, now we go all the way back to the beginning, and it opens with Robert Kraft walking into a diner in Boston in the early 60s. There's music playing. It's late. Robert's Jewish. He's come home from Columbia for the weekend. His father's like a rabbi, not really, but they consider him like the local rabbi in Brookline. And Robert's out with a few buddies, and he gets in line in the diner around midnight, and a pretty girl comes in, gets in line, and she's obviously got a boyfriend. And when they get their food, they sit down at a table, and she sits at the next table. And one of his friends' name is Moose, and one of his other friends' name is Snake. And he asks Moose to get her number. And of course, Moose gets her number. And then Robert starts to pursue her. And the next day, he finds out that, she's at Brandeis, she's a student. And he goes there to find her, and he can't find her. And but he runs into another kid who's Jewish that he knows, and that guy knows Myra, who's also Jewish. That's how they kind of know each other. And this guy says, oh, I know where Myra studies. He says, you can find her, and he tells her where to go. Tells him where to go, and he goes into the library, and sure enough, he finds her. And he tells her, he wants to take her out. And she says, I can't do that. Got a boyfriend. We're going skiing this weekend, blah, 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 blah. And he proceeds to guilt her a little bit. He says, I went through all this trouble to find you, and really want to take you out and everything. And anyways, by the end of the day, Myra's mother has called the boy and said, something's come up and Myra can't go skiing. And Robert takes her out and has to borrow his uncle's car because he's too poor. He doesn't have a car. He doesn't have anything. He borrows his uncle's car. He drives her. They go out. It's a very simple date. But then they end up back at Brandeis, where she's a student. And they sit out in the car, and it's cold. And it's February, and they're talking and talking and talking and talking. And to be honest, when I was learning about this story, this part of it resonated with me because it reminded me in a funny way about falling in love with my own wife, who's here tonight. But we used to go out on dates when we first started dating, and we would get home from the date and we'd sit in the car in the driveway, and we'd talk for a long, long time. And I'm sure her siblings probably thought we were doing more than talking in the car. And we weren't. We weren't. And they weren't. They were just talking. And by the end of that night in the car, she proposed. She proposed to him. And I was able to verify this because it sounds made up, but it's not made up. And I just thought, to me, it was so indicative of how, I don't like to use the word operate here, but how Robert does things. And he went from, how do I get her number, to how do I get her to talk to me, to how do I get her to go out with me when she is linked to someone else, to her asking him to marry her. And that's how it often is with him. And so it answers Pete's other question, which was, how did you keep Tom and Bill together for so long? Bill and Tom never should have been together for 20 years. They shouldn't have. And left to their own devices, they never would have been. And that's not, by the way, a knock on either guy. Joe Montana and Bill Walsh couldn't last 10 years. Chuck Noll and Terry Bradshaw hated Chuck Noll. Hated him. 20 years after he stopped playing football, hated him still. So this is not unique to Bill and Tom. When you're in a situation like they're in and you're playing a sport at this level, under that kind of intensity, with huge egos that are based on success, they have every reason to not be together for 20 years, and that's the genius of Robert. So Pete, I'll just answer it by saying the second part of the question is, one of the last things I did before I finished writing the book was I visited Robert's apartment in New York for the first time. I'd spent a ton of time with him, but I'd never been in his apartment that overlooks Central Park. And I went there one day, I can't remember why I was there, but I went there, and when I got there, he was on the phone in a private room, and the staff person invited me to just sit in the living room and enjoy the view while I waited. And I was looking out the window at Central Park, and I noticed these pictures between the big windows. These windows were huge. They were like that, big openings, glass. And in between them were framed pictures of John, Paul, Ringo, and George. And they were autographed. And I could tell these were real autographs. I mean, not like some fabricated thing. I could tell they were signed. And I'm a huge Beatles fan, and I was like, oh my gosh, like these look like the real article. And so when he came out, he saw me looking at them, and I said, where did you get these? And he started to tell me the whole story. And that was where they stayed. Myra and he stayed there on their honeymoon. In that building that he now owns an apartment in. It was a hotel. It's the Plaza, part of which has been converted to residences now. As soon as the Plaza did that, he bought that one because it was where they stayed on their honeymoon. And he said, you know what else happened here? And I know my Beatles history, so I said, yes, I know the Beatles stayed here when they came to America the first time to be on the Ed Sullivan Show. He said, that's right. And that's why I got those pictures. And the Beatles signed them. And that's why I keep them on the wall. And as he was talking about that, I started saying, how it's such a shame that they only made music for 7 years. The Rolling Stones have made music for 50. These guys couldn't stay together for 10. And then I jokingly said, if you'd been the Beatles manager, they'd probably still be together. And that's what led to the whole analysis for me about how do you keep John and Paul on the stage together? There was no band in the world that had two stars that were that big in the same band. Mick and Keith, it's Mick and then Keith. Right? I mean, John and Paul were John and Paul. They co-wrote all the songs. They were the stars, and George and Ringo were content to be in the background. And that ultimately couldn't be sustained. Well, Tom and Bill are like John and Paul. Equal size egos, equal talent, all kinds of questions about who's more responsible. Instead of arguing about who's a better songwriter, who's more responsible for the wins, all that crap. And that's what Robert did for all those years. Not the first 10, but after 2010 to 20, it was all about that. And that's why I say the first 3 Super Bowls were Bill and Tom. They were most responsible. I wouldn't say, Robert's role in the first 3 was more like assembling a team in an organization. But on the back half, without the owner, there's no way. Because Tom would have been gone. Bill would have traded him when he drafted Jimmy Garoppolo. Gone. Those are the facts. Yeah.
Yeah. Hi. You talk about 3 distinct personalities up there.
Yeah.
And they work together, I don't know if on a day-to-day basis, but one of my questions is, how much time did the 3 of them actually spend together? And who would take the lead of the 3 in any of those conversations? Was it an equal thing, or was it, hey, I'm the owner? I guess that's the question. I mean, how many times did they actually see each other during the year, and who took the lead?
The 3 of them would see each other during the year for a minute and a half during pregame of every home game, when Robert comes out early and stands on the sideline and says hello to Bill and Tom as they come off the field separately to go in the locker room before the game. And then Robert is in the locker room with both of them for 10 to 12 minutes after the game. That's it. The three of them are not together. But Robert spends a lot of one-on-one time with Tom throughout the year. I mean, it got to the point where Robert recruited Tom into his neighborhood in Brookline. Tom built a house a few doors down. I mean, he'd be hanging out in Robert's house with his children, running around in the paneled living room. I mean, it was like family. And Robert would spend a lot of time with Bill. In fact, he spent even more time with Bill than he spent with Tom. But Tom and Bill, in 20 years, I don't think they ever went out to dinner once. The best partnership in the history of football never went out for a beer. I mean, it's just the way it was. So Robert's like a bridge until 2018, when it was literally blowing apart after the Eagles Super Bowl. When I came into the picture, I didn't know it at the time. I learned this a year later. But that living room in Robert's house, Robert calls it the deal room. It's an incredible room that has 3 couches in it, like a square, and the fourth part of the square has no couch. And there's a table in the middle. And Robert calls it the deal room because very big deals were closed in that room. And when it got to the point where it looked like Bill and Tom were just done in 2018 after the Eagles, he summoned them to the deal room. And they came. And the 3 of them sat in the living room, Robert's living room, in his house. Talk about an epic meeting. I mean, so they were together that day. But it was rare for the 3 of them to be together anywhere outside the confines of the football field. But that's what makes the story great. Yeah.
So, Jeff, beyond the big 3, either the most difficult interview to get that turned out to be the most surprising, or the most revealing interview that you had that really opened your eyes to what the book is about?
So the question was, other than the big 3, what was the most difficult interview to get or the most revealing interview? I mean, the most difficult interview to get was the 2 surgeons for a lot of reasons. The surgeon who operated on Drew's chest and the surgeon who closed Tom's hand when it was gashed open before the AFC Championship game, and it required, 18 sutures to close. Those 2 surgeons had never done an interview in their careers because they're not allowed to, and especially not about someone like Tom Brady or Drew Bledsoe. I would say those interviews were the most difficult just because of what I had to do to get authorization for them to talk. And those allowed for creating 2 really dramatic scenes in the book that were kind of mind-blowing for me, and I thought would be wonderful for the reader because it allows you to go in the room with a doctor, and you don't usually get to do that. But in terms of an interview that helped me see who these guys are, that's tough. I mean, I would have to say Jonathan Kraft, who never does interviews with anybody. He's Robert's son. He is the succession plan. He's been at Robert's side since before they bought the team. He's the oldest boy in the family. He's tremendously gifted in terms of his smarts, but more importantly, he is to his father what Bobby Kennedy was to his brother. I mean, he's that. And so he doesn't talk, and eventually he started doing interviews with me, and sometimes our interviews would be 2+ hours nonstop with a recorder running. And I'm just saying, it was like I learned so much about so many things, but certainly about these three personalities. And the thing about Jonathan is he's incredibly objective. Like, Bill is a difficult guy, an incredibly difficult guy who was incredibly disrespectful to Jonathan for 20 years. So you would think that when I interviewed Jonathan about Bill, I would hear a lot of things about how Bill's an asshole. That's not what I heard. I mean, he was the one who really helped me see why Bill is so good at what he does, which is why Robert was willing to put up with it for 20 years. And that's the business they're in. Jonathan was the one who really helped me understand that. And he also helped me understand why Tom put up with it for 20 years and how it worked. So I would say him. I would say him. The son. Yes. Yes, I'll repeat your question.
Thanks, Jeff. Aside from the possibility of just too busy,
Yeah.
was there something else that triggered Kraft to get back to you after 6 months? Usually something like that kind of disappears.
Why did it take Robert Kraft 6 months to...
Something that triggered that reaching out, something changed?
I think, first of all, I don't think 6 months is a long time. The more normal thing would be that he wouldn't reply at all. That would have been normal. Yeah, so I think 6 months is, Robert's a real deliberate guy. One of his most common mantras is measure 9 times and cut once. I mean, that's how he lives his life. Measure 9 times and cut once. I think he measured 9 times with me. Like, he didn't decide after I came up the first time, he didn't say, okay, let's go. He interviewed me 3 times for 2 hours a pop. I mean, he asked me all kinds of questions about my marriage, my relationship with my kids. He asked a lot. It was very due diligence. Like, he was trying to decide if he could get comfortable with something that I was proposing that was very uncomfortable. Like, are you gonna let some guy in my organization, who is this guy? He doesn't know me. And that's a big deal for him to do. And so I think he was taking his time. And yeah, he's a hell of a lot busier than some journalist. And so I just think when he got around to it, he finally reached out. Yeah.
Go ahead.
I think that's all it was.
My question is, Bill question and a Tom question.
A Bill question and a Tom question, okay.
The Bill question is, he was groomed to be the successor and become the coach of the New York Jets.
Yeah.
I wanted to know, how did Robert steal him away from the Jets?
Yeah.
And to become their coach?
Yeah.
And the second question is, those who are Tom Brady fans know that he was drafted very low in the draft, and there were so many other quarterbacks that were drafted before him.
Yeah.
What is it that they saw in Tom Brady to wind up drafting him to become the star that he was? Was it the system?
Sure.
Or was it the talent?
Okay, I can do those easy. The reverse question is just that the Patriots, the one thing they didn't need when Bill didn't get stolen by Robert. He got finessed out of there, and you can't finesse Bill anywhere unless Bill wants to go there. So Bill wanted out of New York. If Leon Hess had remained the owner of the Jets, Bill probably never leaves New York. When Leon Hess passed away and this new guy named Woody came in, Bill saw the writing on the wall and said, I don't want to coach here, but how do I get out of here? Because he had a contract. Well, first of all, we know Bill was right. Look what's happened to the Jets. So he was smart to want to get out. And Robert was kicking himself because 2 years earlier, when he fired Parcells, or excuse me, 3 years earlier when he fired Parcells, he really wanted to hire Bill Belichick. But Robert's all about trust, and he just couldn't trust Belichick because Belichick had come with Bill Parcells. But he was convinced he was the best coach he could possibly hire. So he hired Pete Carroll instead, and from day one, he kicked himself for hiring Pete instead of Bill. And for 3 years, he was trying to figure out how to get him back. Well, that door opened when Parcells decided to retire in New York, which meant the throne would now pass from Parcells to Belichick with the Jets, and Robert knew there was an opening. And he took it. And Bill, on faith, resigned and totally put his trust that Robert would figure out how to get him because there was a contract. And it worked. They made a deal. It was testy. And Parcells insisted on a first-round draft pick, the #1 pick. And the league said he was nuts to give it up. Robert didn't want to give it up, but he gave up a first-round pick. Parcells, everyone said Parcells cleaned his clock in the deal. They drafted a quarterback none of you remember. And Robert got Bill Belichick. It's like getting Babe Ruth from the Red Sox. It's like the most lopsided trade in the history of football. And 2 months later, Bill drafted Tom, not because he saw this great thing in Tom. They had arguably the best quarterback in the NFL at the time, Drew Bledsoe. He had the highest, he was making $100 million. He was the most valuable quarterback on payroll. The only thing that they didn't need was a quarterback. And that's why they didn't draft Tom higher. They didn't need him. They had 3 quarterbacks, one of whom was Drew. So the real question isn't why the Patriots didn't pick him earlier. We know why they didn't. It's why didn't all the other teams? And finally, at the end, Bill and his staff, they kept saying, it's kind of crazy to have a guy that we think probably should have gone in the low part of the first round or the start of the second round, who's still sitting there when you just compared him basically just kind of talent-wise to what's left in the 6th round. It's like, well, just take him. Just take him. I mean, what are we talking about here? Bill had watched him win bowl games and come into the game in the second half when Michigan was behind, and then they'd win. And Bill didn't see like a cannon arm, lightning fast feet. He saw a guy that never felt pressure. Like he'd played in the biggest games. Michigan has over 100,000 seats in his stadium. Tom would be out there like he's on a peewee field. No pressure at all, and that's why they drafted him. And then after one season, at the beginning of the second season, Tom didn't play his first season. People forget that. His second season was the 9/11. And I mean, it's basically at the beginning of that season, before 9/11, that's when Bill told Robert in a private meeting, if I was putting the best quarterback on the field week 1, it wouldn't be Drew. It'd be the kid. And Robert and Jonathan thought he was nuts. What are you talking about? Well, 3 weeks later, they had to play him because Drew got hurt. He had no choice. Put him in. And then people saw a little glimpse of what Bill saw. And the rest is history. So last question. I'm glad it's somebody younger than me.
Have you ever thought about writing a sequel about just Tom?
About what?
Just Tom Brady and his story.
You mean a biography?
Yeah.
About Tom?
Uh-huh.
I have, actually. Yeah. I have. And I think if Tom ever decided, and I know he's thought a lot about it, but if he ever decides to write an autobiography and he's willing to go places like Andre Agassi did, that could be a great book. If he does what a lot of athletes do when they write their biographies, it'd probably be boring. So it really depends. Tom's had an extraordinary life, a very extraordinary life. He's had a kind of life that rock stars and A-list movie stars have. He's had a life that Patrick Mahomes wouldn't even come close to understanding. That's how different Tom's life has been. It's really, really different. He's like LeBron and Tiger. They're three guys that are all alone in the world that they occupy. There's no one else like LeBron. There's no one else like Tiger. There's no one else like Tom. Patrick Mahomes is an incredible quarterback, so is Josh Allen, but it's different. What Tom did was different. When you're married to arguably one of the most recognizable, famous women on earth, and when you marry her, she's worth 10 times as much as you are, and she's world famous, and you're just United States famous. I mean, you talk about biting off a lot. I mean, Tom has done that his whole life. And so I think you're onto a great idea. It's a great question. I hope he does it someday, and I hope he calls me. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Jeff. A fabulous presentation.
And we have lots of goodies left for you to take home on your way out, by the way. Be sure to enjoy them from Cobb Bakery.